as of now. So we're gonna have that like going live on YouTube, but it will also be recorded. So if you were nervous about making notes, relax, you can do that later through the video that will be on YouTube at the Envisioning Tech channel, the channel where we save most of these sessions. And yeah, it is on. I will share the link to our YouTube if you want to share with your friends around. There you go. Is that funky? No. Hey, Steven, I need to be more professional in this session because it's not my session. So I want to be respectful to Lidia, and I don't want to take too much of the attention. But yeah, I love my funky backgrounds. Thanks for noticing. Without further ado, so like I'll just pass the mic and get that. So do we have all the speakers in the room?
Yeah, we do. Can you guys turn the camera on and mics are working, or did I do anything wrong? I'm not very used to this kind of conference on Zoom. Because you're here, but you're not like.
Yeah. Are you? We can't hear you as well. Can you hear them?
Can you guys hear me?
This is. I'm here, but I don't see a camera option.
Okay.
I'm here as well, Bodhi. Can you hear me, Lidia?
Yes.
Yes.
I just need to promote you all as panelists. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's the deal. Yeah, they need to be panelists to be.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think now everyone was invited to be panelists. Just waiting for Alexander and Lauren. Hi, perfect. Yeah, everybody's here. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm very happy to have you here. So let's get started. And well, this is actually a means we find to celebrate the World Futures Day. It was organized by Millennium Project, and the day invites futurists and the general public to work together towards better futures. And for this reason, we at Envisioning organized this panel to talk about science fiction, which is one of the resources we use for our research on emerging technologies. But we want to go further than what blockbusters might see. The future is much more than what the Jetsons imagine, and we want to decolonize not only our present, but also our views of the future. What is your image of the future? Does it look like a Hollywoodian movie, or does it look like a more diversified perspective of what the world could become? How can we make future a plural world rather than a singular destination? For a deep dive in this topic, I invited some people that I really admire and who have been working in this sense by educating audiences about science fiction, as well as different points of view about what the future holds. I asked each of them to prepare a short presentation of themselves and their work, so you can meet them, and afterwards I will ask some questions to warm up the discussion. Unfortunately, Vic Vieira was a panelist, but he had some personal problems and he couldn't join us. But we have instead Monica and Lauren, which are amazing people, and they will do even better than Vic Vieira here. But yeah, maybe another time we can invite him. And yeah, who wants to get started? Who wants to be the first one to present?
I want to be the last one.
I thought so. All right.
I think we can follow the alphabetical order. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah. So hi everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thanks for joining us here. Thanks, Lidia, for the invitation. As Lidia said, my name is Alexander, and I'm a professor at Goiás Federal University. Goiás is a Midwest state in Brazil. I have been teaching there since 2009, and I teach fantasy literature and supervise researches on fantasy, Gothic literature, weird fiction, science fiction, magical realism, which means here we are talking about the fantastic in a broad sense, yeah, not only in the Todorov terms, yeah, but in a broad sense as an umbrella term to encompass all representations of reality in a different perspective. And specifically talking about science fiction, that's why I'm here. I'm interested in Brazilians, the history of Brazilian science fiction dating back to its origins in 19th century, as well as its development in new movements that we can see in this century, yeah? And I think that's it, Lidia.
All right. Who wants to be the next? It's just for the public to know you all, and then we can start talking about the right subject.
I can go next, since we were doing the alphabetical order, I guess.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I am Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Bodhi for short. I am associate professor in global culture studies at the University of Oslo. And I run a couple of large research projects, but under the same umbrella called CoFutures. You can check it out at cofutures.org. It's a project that covers much of the global South in terms of its scope. So all the way from Latin America to China. And we have fellows, we have artists, we have designers, we have architects, we have tech people, we have all kinds of people who are part of this, group, assortment, whatever one wants to call it. And we do a bunch of things. We of course write our academic papers and stuff like that. We also do design work. We also develop video games. So it's a kind of a big big group doing all kinds of funny things. But decolonization is kind of one of the central points of the whole argument, in the sense that we don't talk about it in the sense of science fiction. I see in the participant list we have Francisco Verso, my friend, and also colleague in CoFutures, and he uses the term future fiction. And I think future fiction is a very good term to use for this, because we are talking about human futures. So it's decolonizing futures, and we can talk about decolonizing science fiction, but I think that's kind of a waste of time. So I talk about it in the sense of decolonizing futures. So I'm really excited to be here, and thanks for the invite, Lidia.
Great, thank you for being here. And well, the alphabetical order, then it's Lauren.
Hello, thanks for having me. My name is Lauren Klein. I am a futures researcher, practitioner, sculptor, and stylist. I work in salon spaces and work with individuals to help people understand how we are embodying colonial ideas around beauty and aesthetics, as well as highlighting that the fact that our aesthetics, everything from architecture, any visual language, style, personal aesthetic, is a crystallization of belief systems. So examining how we are seeing ourselves and how that manifests in the world that we are creating, that translates directly into what choices we're making today that are solidifying our potential futures into a smaller scope. I think looking at science fiction futures or decolonizing science fiction is really powerful, because these are the collective images and mainstream images that we're projecting into our future. So I'm based in Mexico, and I'm very happy to be here sharing the stage.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Thanks for being here. And well, Monica asked to be the last one, so it's Sarina now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarina Ulibarri. I am in the southwest of the United States, and I'm a science fiction writer, and I also run a small publishing company called Worldweaver Press. My niche is solar punk, which is a science fiction subgenre. Let me just read my favorite definition of solar punk so that I get all the words right. Solarpunk is a movement of artists, writers, and activists interested in changing the trajectory of our world for the better. As a genre of fiction, solarpunk is optimistic science fiction stories that engage with issues of climate change and social injustice. Solarpunk stories don't always show the specific solutions that led to a better world, but they do always strive to show that better futures are possible. So within that subgenre, what I've done, aside from writing a few stories that have been published, is I've published a bunch of short fiction anthologies. I did 2 anthologies called Glass and Gardens, one focused on summer settings, one focused on winter settings. These both included quite a few international authors. And then we also ran a Kickstarter to bring the Brazilian solarpunk anthology into English. So there was a Brazilian small publisher that was the first one to use that term, and so we had it translated into English so that it could be part of the larger conversation as this niche is growing, as it has been over the past few years. So my most recent project is called Multi-Species Cities. This was a collaboration with a research institute in Japan, and focusing on authors in the Asia Pacific. So we have authors from Singapore and Japan and all the way down to Australia, New Zealand, India, all over. And so we really focused on like that region of the world and asked them to tell, their version of solarpunk stories, so those optimistic science fiction stories, but also focusing on sort of more than human futures, how we can re-envision our urban spaces to be not so human-centered. So that's our most recent project. It comes out in April, and yeah, that's why.
Great, thanks, Irina. And well, now it's you, Monica, the last one.
Thank you. Greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa. Glad to join. Very last minute. It's a bit late here, so my mind is in a bit of a slow motion. I loved everything that Serena said. Your work sounds dope, so I'm very glad to be on the same panel and to read more of the stuff that you've done, as well as everybody else. Lauren, I know you. Lidia, I know you as well in person. So I am futures researcher, futurist, and futures designer. So as futures researcher, I've been traveling the world for the past 9 years as a full-time nomadic journey. I felt that if you're going to talk about the future, you got to live the future, at least in my case. So definitely that nomadic experience across the world and as much as I can in different parts of Global South has been really, really important and really informative. And I think as a futurist, my approach differs from quite a lot of other established people in the industry, especially typical sort of like white male Silicon Valley futurist, who generally tend to have an idea about the future and sort of their work is very much about proselytizing it. Everything that I do, the foundation is really the research. It's finding future where it emerges on the ground, and really trying to challenge myself in my very own perceptions. So as a futurist, my work is really very much about looking not just into science and tech, but at the intersection of science and tech, as well as culture and politics. And again, from the perspective of the oppression rather than the oppressor as much as possible. And I also think of my futurism very much as my activism. So my goal when I give talks or do consulting, both with grassroots organizations and educational institutions, as well as some sort of leading organizations and enterprises in the world, is not to give them more of what they want to hear or confirm them in their perceptions or make them feel good or allow them to tokenize my work, but really challenge and maybe invite them to find ways to participate in more inclusive and more humane and more than just human futures. And last but not least, I've been involved in a various science fiction projects in Hollywood and outside of that format as well. as a world designer, so as a partner to directors to craft out these future worlds. That felt quite unsatisfactory because of entertainment industry's love with dystopia. And more recently, I've been focused on Protopia Futures, which is a project of my own with a whole set of amazing creators and collaborators, especially in the digital space, but also in the narrative space and activist space, to craft out sort of radically inclusive futures with a specific focus on indigeneity, queerness, and disability, that really talk about the future of hope. Not a perfect future, but a future where we've come together. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, I think I will just ask the first question, connecting what Monica and Sarina said, because here's a question that I have and a personal curiosity of mine. Because yeah, when we talk about science fiction, like Monica said, many times people think about dystopias, and some people who are not very into science fiction, they might remember the genre after titles like Matrix, Black Mirror, Terminator, and so on. But you are bringing another perspective to science fiction. Of course, there's much more to be seen in the whole genre. But it was interesting because recently I read a book by a French historian called Georges Minois. The book is called The History of the Future. And he mentions that utopias are not very interesting because if they are fulfilled, they are turned into dystopias. For instance, in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, we have a society where utopia was achieved because everything works well, everybody has a kind of comfortable life, but for that they lost their ability to express themselves, and they were modified in a genetically sense. So what I wanted to ask both of you, and of course all the panelists are free to contribute, it's not just for one or two people. What do you think about this? Do you think that more optimistic sci-fi genres like solar punk or even Afrofuturism, do they pose a kind of danger in this sense of when a utopian perspective is fulfilled, it could be turned into a dystopia? Did I make myself clear?
100%. Serena, I'll let you start.
Sure. So I don't believe in utopia because people live in it, and people will always find a way to be miserable. Robot utopia, alien utopia, maybe these things are possible, but as soon as you bring human beings into it, nah. I don't think it's even possible. And the word utopia means nowhere, right? It was Thomas More's Utopia was a thought experiment, and it was never meant to be a real thing. So I really love the term protopia and some of those other terms that are similar but not utopia. So so it's interesting that you bring up like Hollywood movies being dystopian in this, because for a couple of reasons. So first of all, Hollywood caters to the lowest common denominator. Really popular science fiction films are the ones that can be enjoyed on a very surface level, and also have another layer under that you can dig into if you are able to do that, interested to do that. The Matrix is a fantastic example of this, because it is a very complex and layered film. But it can also just be, a fun action movie if you're not paying attention. And they talk about in The Matrix how the first version of The Matrix was a utopia, and they didn't get the energy that they needed from the people in that setting. So they created different. They set it at a different a time in human history that is like stable but not perfect, and people were a lot more engaged with that. So humans aren't built for utopia. Utopia is static, and humans are dynamic. So protopia is a much more interesting idea to me. Things are better, but they're never going to be perfect. And what I think about when I'm working on solar punk, or either writing it or choosing stories to represent it, is within the world of the story, who is not being served by that system? Who are the people that are left out? Who are the people that are not well served? And then asking, are they the same people that are not well served by our current system? And that's part of the decolonization to me, is if it's the same people, either you need to directly, talk about that and make that part of the point of the story, or reimagine your world in a way that that doesn't just center the same privileges of our current world. So that's part of my thought about utopia, dystopia. Another thing is just that dystopia is easier. It's always easier to see what will go wrong. Is much more challenging, takes much more creative will to imagine how things go right. And in terms of like the risk of something like an optimistic science fiction turning into a dystopia, is that you can undermine your own world by figuring out what can go wrong instead of just focusing on what can go right. So it's a difficult trajectory to imagine a better future. It's much easier to imagine the negative outcomes.
Sure. Monica, want to say anything?
Yeah, 100%. So I do agree and echo most of what Serena was saying. But my reading is a bit different. So yes to all the points. However, and that's the reason why I ended up working on Utopia and crafting that whole framework, and we're releasing a manifesto next week. And that's like something that's been a year in the works. Is that I find utopia, dystopia completely a false binary. For me, it's just two reverse sides. And I'm sure that Serena, you're not going to be in disagreement with that. It's just two reverse sides of the same coin. And, corporate futurism is very much like promoting this sort of, disinfected vanilla utopia. And then Hollywood is promoting dystopia. But both of these things are just completely one and the same thing. Somebody's utopia is always somebody else's dystopia. We have to remember as well historically that for the Nazis, Nazi Germany was a creation of utopian state. It was also, very much of the holistic thinking and environmentalism and stuff like that. I mean, Hitler was all over that shit. But, their utopia required killing off the Jews, and myself also as having, Holocaust in my very lineage, so it required, killing the Jews, the gypsies, the queer people, the disabled people, right? So utopias have always been profoundly racist, ableist, xenophobic, etc., etc., etc. I'm in South Africa right now. I mean, apartheid was a utopia for the Afrikaners, right? Until as recently as 1994. And so we kind of have to remember that. And that's why, I was like, we have to create a new framework, because everybody just keeps bouncing off dystopia, utopia, dystopia, utopia. And even some of the most, really brilliant people. I remember reading, This Changes Everything, on one of the more recent books of Naomi Klein, where she was speaking about the LEAP manifesto, and she was still referring to utopia as futurist framework. And I felt like if thinkers as brilliant, as informed as herself keep falling back onto something that just really doesn't work at its very core. Because utopias have always been profoundly colonial, profoundly exclusionary. They are anchored in deeply monocultural sort of thinking and mode of existence, and especially in terms of disability activism, disability thought is really important in my work, and truly has been probably the most informative thought in shaping protopia thinking, alongside, Black radical feminism and indigenous thought, et cetera, et cetera. So many authors and everything inform my work, but disability thinking has really, really been fundamentally important. And literally every utopia that I've read about is profoundly ableist. So that's a non-starter. And so I think for me, it's really about that. It is a false binary and we need new frameworks. And protopia for me is just one of those things. And then I'm looking forward to so many other alternatives to these two, really failed notions that are limiting the possibilities of our future thinking. And really, they're not just fictions. They bleed back into our reality, and they really not open but close down our imagination of what can be.
Yes, yeah, that was what I was thinking when I mentioned Noah's thought. But yeah, one thing that I see in science fiction as a genre is that many subgenres are being created as a means to think other perspectives on the future. Especially here in Brazil, we have a couple of some genres that are arising, like for instance, Sertão-punk, which is kind of, Alexander help me, but I don't know the translation in English, but, or even Amazon futurism.
A kind of hinterland punk, something like that.
Yeah, so yeah. Could you please share more about these subgenres that are being developed here in Brazil, please?
Yes, in fact, first of all, I just like to start agreeing with Serena when she says that I don't believe utopias. I don't believe utopias either. Yeah, in my point of view, in every utopia, you have the shadow of dystopia. Yeah, I believe that we have, as human beings, we have an inevitable tendency to oppress the other. Yeah, and that's why we have always to be aware of our demons. But talking about this case of Sertão-punk that could be translated something like a hinterland punk, is a new approach, a new view on the northeast of Brazil. Because generally in Brazil, principally from the perspective of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, which are the principal cities in Brazil in terms of publishing houses, there is a tendency to see the northeast of Brazil as a dry place, a poor place, a place of violence, of cangaço. I don't know how to translate cangaço.
It's like social banditism.
Yeah, like social bandits in Brazil. So what Sertão-punk challenges, and challenge is the word, is to promote a new vision, wants to create a new vision on northeast, a vision that is created by writers from this place. Yeah, so Sertão-punk was created by Gabriel Diniz, Alex Silva, Yalan de Sá, and they are trying to show a different perspective on this reality of Brazil. The problem in Brazil is that at least we can say that only in this century, through the beginning of the 21st century, we can see that Brazilian science fiction writers, they are beginning to be proud of using Brazilian ideas, proud of using folklore, for example, proud of its uniqueness in terms of culture. Yeah, because we are in a continental country. Yeah, we have Amazonia, we have Pantanal, we have several places. And these visions, they are beginning to be used in our science fiction.
Cool. And well, speaking about this, being proud about our culture, there's a new series on Netflix, Brazilian series called Invisible Cities, that is based on our folklore. Maybe you guys would be interested to check. But my another question would be, like, here in Brazil, we have this concept, this idea of Captain Barbosa syndrome, which is basically arguing that Brazilian authors shouldn't write grandiose space operas or fantastic stories where you have a spaceship captain, for instance, and he's called like José Barbosa or whatever Brazilian normal name, because nobody will take it seriously. It's better to call him like John Smith or whatever, but in another language, because then giving him a native name. So Alexander, could you tell us a little bit more about these and your opinion about that?
Yeah, this was a common debate in Brazilian science fiction in the 90s. Yeah, because of this deep influence of American science fiction here in Brazil. But the point is that we have to be aware that, for example, this space opera theme is a common idea in American science fiction, because we can see its roots since the dime novels, the question of the frontier, to explore, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Yeah, as Star Trek uses it. Then we don't have this in Brazil. We don't have this sense of exploring. Yes, that's why, in a first point of view, it seems strange, for example, to have a space opera developed in Brazil. But on the other hand, we can use the same idea, use it in different ways. Monica was talking that she's more interested in the oppression, in the oppression than in the oppressor. So that's the point of view. For example, we can create, for example, a space opera based on the ones who live in the lower decks. Yeah, based on the ones, Babylon 5, for example, just to mention a popular science fiction TV series, Babylon 5 explored this idea. Who are the ones who live in the lower decks of a space station? So I think that Brazilian science fiction, because of our social problems, we can use the same topics, but in a different perspective. So in my point of view, there's no problem at all to write space operas here in our country. Roberto Souza Causo, for example, one of the great sci-fi science fiction writers, he has his space opera universe, yeah, in which his capital is Jonas Peregrino, which means the Brazilian name who is there facing the universe.
And it's good that you mentioned Roberto, because he also created a subgenre here in Brazil called Tupini Punk, which would be our Brazilian version of cyberpunk. And Tupini comes from Tupiniquim, one of the indigenous tribes here in Brazil, and the punk comes after cyberpunk. Could you tell us a little bit more about this subgenre, Alexander, please?
Yes, Tupiniquim punk.
Yeah, could I just add to something that Alexander was speaking about?
Yeah, I want to comment as well.
Yeah, sorry.
Because we're going into a different subject, and I would love to hear about what Alexander has to say to it. But I wanted to go back to space operas and sort of specifically American obsession with it. And I really, really think it is absolutely a neo-colonial storytelling. And that neo-colonial storytelling is very much about justifying the original sin of the creation of United States of America, which is, not an American dream, it's an American nightmare created on stolen land by stolen people. And creating these space operas and speaking about it as and it translates absolutely to what industry is focused about right now. Space colonialism is the deus ex machina of capitalism. And years ago already, I was in this talk with, I mix up the American military ranks, but it was like, 4-star colonel or something like that. The former CEO of Lockheed Martin, there was a NASA astronaut, and they were speaking how the next sort of capitalist frontier is really the asteroid mining, and that is the battle. That is the current battle, because that wealth is the wealth that would dominate, geopolitics on Earth, right? But it's sort of being justified, under this guise of exploration, but it is not exploration, it is colonialism. That's where you get people like Elon Musk saying colonizing Mars, and everybody cheering up. Oh my God, he's a good guy. He's like somehow the savior for our future. Like, a lot of people think about it unironically, but if you start with that phrase of colonizing Mars, you already are starting from the wrong foot. There's no way for you to do it right because you haven't even inquired what went wrong, you know, in this instance of the original colonization upon which the country was created. And there's no way forward into any utopia or even just any livable future unless we reckon with that history. Mm-hmm. And space operas tend to be specifically about not just not reckoning with that history, but truly perpetuating the lie of history written not by the winners. It's not winners, it's the oppressors, it's the exploiters, it is the murderers, right? And we can move forward upon that mythology. Sorry, just that, these are just my two or 10 or 20 pinches of salt.
I wanted to add to that as well, is that the genre is generally exactly as you said, Monica. It's like, it is absolutely colonialist, a colonialist projection with pre-distributed power structures of domination and class structure. And you know, what we are seeing actually is that the way that futures are being distributed through storytelling presently is that many groups have to advocate for their own futures, even within the storytelling, within the genre of science fiction. So just that, I think that it's already, you know, like the fact that all cultures now are in a position of necessity where they have to write their own stories of future, but are still projecting into the future where this distribution has already happened is a huge problem.
Yeah, Flash Gordon and Bucky Rogers. Flash Gordon and Bucky Rogers.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. The fantasy, patriarchal, dominating, sexist, racist framework at this point kind of lives on in mainstream science fiction, pop science fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that, you know, we can imagine intergalactic space travel in our physical bodies, which is quite unrealistic to start with, you know, in the flesh traveling in space is just not, it's not very feasible within the space-time as it is. You know, but we can imagine that, but we can't imagine society that is not misogynist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, et cetera, However, I'm seeing Bodhisattva's comment in a chat that is super, super relevant about Afrofuturism. And, you know, I mean, I think immediately of amazing authors such as Nnedi Okorafor with her Binti trilogy, really challenging these notions. So Bodhisattva, I'm sure you have quite some interesting things to say on that.
Yeah,
so,
I was going to ask him to introduce a little bit.
It's not all space opera. It's just specifically that kind of like, you know, the domineering idea of what space operas are. Not all space operas have to be that way.
Yeah, that's it. That's the problem. A part of the problem, I'm sorry, that's the part of the problem with space operas in Brazil, because there is a debate here that how was the development of science fiction in this country? The point is that in Brazil, we never had a scientific, let's say, thinking in a way that could promote changes in society. Yeah, usually. So how can I be clear about that? Usually, Braulio Tavares and Roberto Souza Causo, they believe, for example, that the problem in Brazil is that we never had a active science that could promote social changes in Brazil. That's why we don't see science as something as important as it is in America. Yeah, and so that's why science fiction in Brazil followed other tendencies. Lidia was talking about Tupinipunk. Tupinipunk is Roberto Souza Causo's idea. It's similar to cyberpunk, but is more based on the punk side of it, in the sense that Tupinipunk wants to explore racism, wants to explore our deep social problems, wants to explore carnival, for example, yeah, which means topics that are not approached in normal science fiction. That's it.
From what I saw in
So
the
beautiful.
chat, but Professor Buddy has some research going on co-futures about these topics, right? Sorry, Lauren, you were going to add something. Sorry.
Oh, I just said I think that's so beautiful. The idea of exploring all the mythology and richness around that, around carnival and the dance and the costumes and the movements.
Yes, Sertão Punk is doing the same, but based Sertão Punk, northeast of Brazil is deeply marked by magical realism. And now they're joining it with, for example, afrofuturism. Mm-hmm. And so the result of it is Sertão Punk.
I want to take just a second to kind of make a case for this idea of aesthetic futures as a point of inquiry. Just thinking about dance and body movement and that visual language and where that comes from, connection with land, and then the expression of body and the expression of spirit through the adornment of the body. And, across all cultures, this exists, this incredible expression of deep relationship with nature, with body, with music, with rhythm, with voice, vocalization, with our hair, with our face. And that when we look at that, we look at the histories, we look at how that has dispersed around the planet. It tells the whole story of migration, of place, of identity. And when we look and then looking forward, first, looking where we are today. I'm from the US, and it's just, the idea of plurality hasn't explicitly been spoken, although it's been spoken about quite a bit in the talk. But, we learn about plurality by looking at aesthetics. So when we think about futures, or when I think about futures and plural futures and protopian futures, I think about like the entire ecosystem and ecology of how we are adorning ourselves, what that means for our kind of alliances that we're making, where we're spending the money, and how does that translate into the future, and bringing it back to that idea of like the space opera. The way that characters are portrayed, of course, is through the physicality of their body and what they're adorning their bodies with. So just the idea, I've been watching so much Saupe. Is that the Brazilian dance of carnival? I'm not sure. The samba, and there's a specific set of movements. I think it's called Saupe, a sequence of movements, and it's so embedded, and it's just so beautiful. So that's just brings it back to body for me.
Can I jump in to respond to that real quick? Because, with solar punk, the aesthetic is a big part of it. And a lot of people have, talked about that being kind of a superficial thing, but I don't think it is. And I think the visual aspect of, seeing like these cities redone in a very green, sustainable way is that's what draws people in, or seeing the different fashions, breaking out of the fast fashion and more like do-it-yourself, or artistic fashion, and things that break out of that. So I think the aesthetic is incredibly important. And it reminded me of a story that I actually wanted to mention back in the Utopia discussion. One of the stories in the first Glass and Gardens anthology is called Watch Out Red Crusher by Shel Graves. And it is a utopian story where the main conceit is that people power their little community. It's very small and integrated community. People power their community through these like solar nanite implants in their bodies that glow. They absorb the sun and then they glow, and somehow this like powers all of the electronics or whatever in their city. But the glow is influenced by people's emotions. So you're basically showing, if you're angry, it glows red. If you're sad, it glows blue, these kind of stereotypical colors, but where you can really see what's going on inside is now presented on the outside in this kind of artistic way. And so their bodies are power, and it's also, and the glow, the color of the glow is part of what undermines the utopia of this story, because people who are prone to anger or to violence are ostracized, and it brings up the question, what do you do with those people in this world? And the answer in this story was they get essentially kicked out into the wildlands, and and the story is about grappling with how problematic that is, and just this idea of the inside emotions being presented on the outside. So anyway, I thought that tied a little bit into the aesthetics that Lauren was talking about as well.
Cool. So please, Professor Botsapa, can you share with us a little bit of what you're working on co-futures? And I think it's all connected to what we are discussing here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I could basically jump in with comments on pretty much everything that has been spoken on so far, but I just don't feel like interrupting because it's also interesting. No, I wanted to go back to a few things. One to the panel title, which is Decolonizing Futures, and somehow we've kind of like we're not really tackling that at all head on so far, except in perhaps Monica, your points. I think that we have to get back to that discussion because one of the interesting things that we are not talking about when we are talking about all these futurisms or utopias or dystopias, we're not talking about translations. We are not talking about reading most of the damn world. And why aren't we doing that? You mentioned Sertao-punk and Tupini-punk, and that's fantastic to bring that into the conversation. And Francisco is commenting on the side on how we are getting more Chinese SF. When we are talking about space opera and space opera as this final frontier imaginary and all of that, I mean, that is kind of an old hat discussion in science fiction. Because it's been the longest critique of Star Trek, right? And Star Trek has been running since the 60s, like space, the final frontier. That's the argument against Star Trek, right? And I use a Star Trek mug, right? I'm fond of Star Trek, so don't get me wrong. But that's the discussion, right? Now, a lot of what has been happening, this challenge also to, reimagine science fiction, bring it more, down to earth. What you commented on, Alexander, earlier, that that it has to be more rooted, and that kind of started in the 90s. There's the mundane science fiction movement, which kind of kicked off this whole, in the Anglophone world, that you're going to have to write. You can't just write, imagine faster than light travel, and so on and so forth. So you have to bring it more to the real world, and so on, and the issues of the real world. And then the thing is, what has been happening since then? Because mundane science fiction is 2004, right? And this is also the period in which afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, and all these other futurisms kind of they explode. They go all over the place, right? And translations started. That Rachel Cordasco has this fantastic database called Science Fiction in Translation, sfintranslation.com, which I would recommend checking out. It is an fantastic resource for everything that is being translated, from all these different languages into English. And she's maintaining this database almost with other people, but almost single-handedly, she has built this resource, right? And she has brought this entire discussion in a way to the Anglophone world, right? But we are still not doing enough. There's a lot that's happening. For instance, Francisco is doing a lot. There are a lot of translations coming out of Chinese and so on and so forth. So I would, when we talk about space opera, we talk about colonialism and all of that, then why are we referring to old works? Why are we not referring to the works that are actually deconstructing those ideas, that are destroying those ideas? In Anglophone world, for instance, I would mention something like River Solomon, for instance, and Unkindness of Ghosts, right? As a fantastic work. Monica, you mentioned Binti. That's another fantastic work. There's a lot that's going on. These, we don't need to go back to these old examples. Let's find new ones. And let's engage in a discussion about decolonizing futures, which brings into this discussion most of the world, and not just discussing again and again science fiction. Science fiction is, that's why I said it's kind of boring. So the setup of Co-Futures was precisely set up for that reason, to discuss works from the rest of the world. So we have somebody who can work in, Brazilian science fiction or Chinese science fiction or Middle Eastern science fiction. I don't speak those languages, but when we think together, when we act together, when we work together, we might be able to do something else. So let's bring other examples. Let's go back to decolonizing futures as a discussion point. That would be my contention. So I would like to hear from all of you what you think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. It reminds me of how cyberpunk tried to bring this more diverse perspective, especially in aesthetic point of view, when you see like titles, especially movies, bringing the representation of other ethnicities, or even like, I remember one of my favorite movies, cyberpunk movies, was an Italian movie that was based on Indian mythology called Nirvana. I don't know if you guys know the movie. But it's interesting to see how cyberpunk brought this idea of representing a world that everything is all together in terms of cultural and national references. But some people now are discussing if this is not actually racist, or kind of making tropes about national identities and religion. So this is another thing that happens currently when we see so many remakes, and even the launching of Cyberpunk 2077, so many people talked about the problems in terms of gender representation and also representation of different ethnicities. So yeah, I was wondering if we're kind of falling in this trap that Bodhi was talking about, because it's like Mark Fisher says about ontology, we're just living in the past, or the idea of the future that the past has imagined. So it would be amazing to hear more from you. What titles, what books, what games or movies, or even subgenres that are working in this sense that Bodhi was talking about, really decolonizing our ideas of the future in terms of religion, ethnicity, sorry, I can't pronounce this correctly, religions, gender, sexuality. I mean, I only have a very old classic reference in this sense, but for instance, after reading Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin, it was like an explosion in my mind, because I never had seen anything like The Left Hand of Darkness and then the Xenogenesis saga by Octavia Butler. So I'm really eager to know more titles that are like this, that really blow our minds in these senses. Could you, any of you, contribute with some ideas, recommendations?
Before we go into recommendations, I wanted to comment something that you said about cyberpunk. And as I said, I work quite a bit in Hollywood and met quite a few of those folks in person. And so it's a different reading that I have sometimes when certain movies are released. And when Blade Runner 2049 was released, I was kind of like white with rage. And some people were looking at it and saying that, yes, but, Ridley Scott is criticizing these things, but I'm like, not at all. Like, there was enough representation for criminals and prostitutes and yakuzas by Asian folks in that movie. However, every lead character was white. So it was kind of very consciously or subconsciously, strategically racialized casting that implies a whole lot of a political reality. And so my problem with a lot of that stuff, I mean, you know, in that Blade Runner 2049, that main sort of cyber girl lover character, you know, she's wearing these sort of Chinese dresses, and there's all this writing in Hindi and in Korean and in Japanese. So there are elements of cultures, like collages stuck together, but there's no people representing those cultures. And I love, you know, one of my favorite authors currently and thinkers is Tyson Yukapura, who's an First Nations Australian author, and his amazing book Sand Talk that, you know, Lydia, we discussed as well quite a lot. You know, he speaks about it, how even with indigenous cultures, you know, and indigenous authors, you know, people want to bring in and kind of see the dances and kind of exotic aspects and, oh, what is this cool herb that you use? But they don't actually want to hear the critique of the current state of things and the social structures from those indigenous perspectives, right? So I feel that's the problem with a lot of the cyberpunk. And don't get me wrong, you know, like there's some of the, you know, for me, I think the Japanese sort of, especially Ghost in a Shell, original Ghost in a Shell by Mamoru Oshii, as well as the standalone complex, was really, really formative for me. And Ghost in a Shell Innocence from 2004, like it really made me want to do what I do. But Mamoru Oshii's cyberpunk version was very, very different to what I think Hollywood then made out of it, which was really about cultural tokenism, you know, and cultural vampirism, and never about actually real cultural representation. You know, and so I think it's very important to kind of recognize when it is about representation and when it's just about tokenization and taking elements in that very exploitative manner. And I think that definitely cannot be the future of the genre. And, you know, Cyberpunk game did that with a trans character. Like the trans representation was completely criticized by trans and genderqueer community because it was done in a way that was, you know, profoundly misrepresentative and fetishized. But on to the positive examples. I feel like I'm just being like, oh, this is all bad. No, there's amazing things, and y'all
like
gonna tell all about it.
It's much easier to criticize and be negative about stuff.
Well, critique is the foundation of it. You know, I think we can't move into better things if we don't understand. And I think also if we talk about decolonizing anything, you know, the step number one of decolonizing future is actually decolonizing history and starting to tell the real history and not history from the perspective of the oppressor. It's peeling off these layers of lies and misrepresentations. And only upon that foundation, we can build something that is more inclusive, that is kinder, so on and so forth, you know?
Mm-hmm. And it also reminds me of how science fiction here in Brazil was structured, as Alexander just mentioned, because at the beginning of the genre here, many people were using like references from English works written in English and trying to replicate the same tropes and the same ideas. And then we had Tupinipunk, which was an attempt to make a cyberpunk version, like in Brazilian sense. But there were some other stereotypes and other prejudice represented there. For instance, in the way women are presented, or even sexuality when you talk about Latin American people. So I was wondering, how could we change this? Because one thing that happens here in Brazil, I don't know if abroad this is something that usually happens, but when you have like invitations to short stories collection, many times we have the publishing house saying, you must write the story happening in Brazil, for instance. You need to talk about your own national context. Do you, all of you, think this is something important in terms of telling the story not from the oppressor's perspective, as Monica was saying? Or do you think this is like kind of turning into tokenism as a means to allow people to publish stories?
Yeah, it seems a little oppressive, no? there are Brazilians all over the world, right? Like, why can't it just be from the perspective of a Brazilian as opposed to like with that embedded culture in them and their vision?
Yeah, but I was wondering, like, is it like we're talking about decolonizing futures, and is it important me as a Brazilian or whatever everyone comes from, Argentinian, American, not American, but maybe French or Japanese, to write stories that encompass my culture, my national identity, or is it like a limitation of the art making itself?
Well, I have a lot of friends. I have a few female Black American women painter friends. They're artists, they're painters. And we have many conversations because around the idea, like, why can't I just be an abstract painter? Why can't I just be an artist? Why do I feel the pressure that I have to be the representative and speak about directly about my culture? And, you know, and I think you're saying the same thing. And I think that is part of decolonizing futures, right? Is like not imposing or not feeling pressured. And speaking of that perspective of like the oppressed and the oppressor, what I think about is like, how do you let up from the pressure on the oppressed? Like, if the oppressed is the person who's inside this little circle, what do you do? How can we take responsibility to expand that pressure so that the oppression is less, right? And I think to the point of Professor Bodhi is like, what are the ways to decolonize the future? And those are the main things I think about. It's the intentional choices around depressurizing the oppressed, right? And how do we do that? We expand the vision that's being projected, and it like Monica was saying, like, trans characters that are trans characters, and it doesn't have to be, it's not a stereotypical projection or fetishization of what it is to be trans, or what it has been viewed by the mainstream culture onto that person. It has to be that the person is centered and has the expression of self. And when I see, and all the science fiction I have seen, and the futures that I have seen, in fact, to move from speaking about science fiction into speaking about futures, is our mental frameworks are still so strong, and it has to do with the binary. It has to do with like women being, you know, somewhat, you know, dainty and feminine, and we don't see a ton of exploration that don't use these kind of tropes. I mean, it exists, but, and I am not somebody who has really excellent examples of the contemporary works around future science fiction, but
I think, you know, this is a very, especially on Twitter, this is quite an intense conversation around who has the right to write what. And when it becomes cultural appropriation, when it becomes exploitative, when it becomes tokenization. The truth is that, you know, if not every story is written from the first person perspective, and if we want stories as well as films be inclusive, you know, they have to contain all kinds of characters, right? And a particular writer, author, or director cannot be all of these characters that will be living their lives in that particular story world that is created, right? However, when people are writing about experiences or doing films or any project, video games, about experiences that are entirely not theirs and that they don't have any intimate connection with, you know, it can become very exploitative and profoundly inaccurate. I mean, there are all these memes on Twitter as well as sort of like male authors writing, you know, women characters, and all the jokes around that. But, you know, I want to specifically point out just an amazing book in general, and it's quite a short one. But an author, Kat Holmes' book, Mismatch. that is really, really incredible. Now, Kat Holmes is not disabled, but she has disabled children, right? And she's really delved very deep in disability actions and disability thought. And that book specifically is about technological frameworks around disability. And it's truly an extraordinary book. Now, it's not my place to say if it's completely accurate. You know, I think somebody within, you know, especially, you know, physical disability community would be able to comment better. However, you know, that book is quite extraordinary. Because the subject of disability is not just something she just decided to write about. Oh, I'm going to write a book about disability because disability is trending right now. You know, it's actually something that is very deep in her life, and that she really spent not just years, but decades understanding, exploring, being part of it, working towards disability justice. And that's why that book is incredible, you know. And I think a lot of these things, you can't just jump into it. And I'll go as far as saying that even science fiction itself, I think in literature, a lot of science fiction authors are predominantly science fiction authors. And in the film industry, that's not the case, right? So a lot of directors will direct a historical movie and a fantasy movie, and then they're going to just do a sci-fi movie, right? You know, a lot of production designers will do the same. And, you know, when they come towards people like me, we can help, because we can help them understand different complexities of technology and science and future politics, etc. But it's very hard for somebody that doesn't have the base foundation, at least sort of like the basic understanding of what is not even the bleeding edge, but if they don't even understand what is the cutting edge of emergent politics, emergent science, emergent technology, it becomes nearly impossible for them to tell anything truly relevant about the future. And so I think, you know, any true groundbreaking thing in a realm of representation requires real understanding of the issues and real immersion. You can't just jump into it like that because it's cool right now.
Yeah.
I really agree with everything that Monica just said. Thank you for all of that. I wanted to add, just part of the problem with this whole issue is that if you know, people outside of the United States, people in marginalized communities of whatever kind, if they are not writing their own stories, there will always be a white person in America who is willing to write that story, and they'll get it wrong. You know, they'll do it poorly, but there will always be, you know, some white person in America that's going to write that story instead. And so, you know, do you have to be, you know, a Black writer? Can't you just be a writer? You know, things like that. Like, eventually, the more examples we have of this in the literature, we'll get to that point. But for now, I mean, we're still getting there, and the publishing houses in America are shifting. They're feeling the pressure of these conversations, and they're also understanding that it's profitable to, you know, to publish these kind of things, that people want these kinds of stories. And, you know, so capitalism wins, right? If they can make money off of it, they're more willing to do it. So buy the books that are telling these stories, and that helps convince you know, the publishers that they want more of these kinds of books. And then it isn't just a tokenization. They have their one Black writer for the season. They have their one Asian writer for the season. You know, we're breaking out of that, but it hasn't broken yet. We're still breaking it. In terms of a couple of examples of recommendations for books, I read a lot of short fiction. So I have short fiction anthology suggestions. One is called Rebuilding Tomorrow. And this was published by an Australian press. And it's focused on like apocalyptic futures, but centering disabled people. And there's all kinds of intersectionality throughout all of the stories, and authors from all over the world writing these stories. So I think it's a fantastic example of optimistic, you know, futures that are told from, you know, very different perspectives than your normal Western, you know, white centric. So that's one example. Another is, I haven't read a ton of work in translation. I really need to read more, but there's one anthology called Castles in Spain that's Spanish science fiction and fantasy. It's been translated into English, and it contains some of the most beautiful stories I've ever read. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And then within my own company, the Multi-Species Cities anthology has 2 stories that are translated from Japanese, as well as stories from Filipino writers and Indian writers and many others. And we did publish an anthology last year called Recognize Fascism, which contains authors from, I think, 9 different countries, including 2 stories translated from Spanish by Chilean authors. So sorry for the self-promotion, but I did want to mention those that we did. So.
when you're making the difference. So it's not
exactly. And I could be,
exactly.
and we could be doing more. I could be doing more, but
you should do more. Well, anyone want to add another recommendations, or can I ask some questions? The public. Okay. Please.
I had plenty.
yeah, I suppose so. The chat is really rich with content.
Let me pull out a whole list.
I'm just typing away in that chat. Like,
I'm so going to save this because it can't be just here. It needs to be shared. So we'll share.
I think I'm kind of footnoting what Monica and everybody else has been saying. Like said the one that you mentioned, that looks like such a fabulous anthology. Yeah, so it's all on pre-order and everything. I mean, there is, in terms of like recommendations, I mentioned like reading more stuff from the rest of the world. There is definitely a lot of Chinese SF in translation that one can pick up. Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide, which came out a couple of years ago, is highly recommended if people haven't picked up a copy yet. I can type that too in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that you type the titles in case people don't understand when we are talking, so we can register in the chat, please.
And next time we have to have audio captions. Somebody mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. Sorry about that. We're going to work on that. Make sure to do that.
Yeah, and Francisco mentioned Broken Stars, Invisible Planets, which are like anthologies of short fiction that Ken Liu edited. Those are also highly recommended. There's a lot of stuff out there in translation. There's also stuff that I really, really love by Indian writers such as Vandana Singh. Her latest collection, Ambiguity Machines, came out, I think, in 2018. It's a collection of short fiction, highly recommended. But I wanted to raise a slightly different point in the sense of like, the question of like also reading less, and what you mentioned earlier, Monica, how do you tell people, that these are like, that there are other ways to think this, right? That, and that's such a question, because a lot of people are also typing in that chat, and somebody has raised that in the Q&A, which is, based on this conversation, do you think that people can only write about their own experiences? Where does creativity stop and appropriation begin? And I think one of the big things that is the question, there is the notion of tokenization of diversity. There is also the question of inclusion, right? And then, like, one is, of course, watching Ghost in the Shell. The other is casting a white actress as the lead when you remake Ghost in the Shell, right? So when you could have done otherwise, there is no real reason why they couldn't have found a Japanese actress. There's no real reason why.
Gucci was made for that role. Like,
exactly.
Rinko is Motoko.
Yeah.
But, and so actually I was there on Ghost in the Shell, sort of very early stages, and can't talk too much about it. But literally the studio's logic was that, but Scarlett is a big star, so that's going to make money. Whereas it was so timely. If you had any insight, any foresight thought, is actually having an Asian lead actress would have had such a momentum. And especially among Asian American audience, there was such a longing for that representation. Whereas Ghost in a Shell and Scarlett Johansson, these are not overlapping fan bases. As well as, you know, her honorarium was like over $20 million for that as well. Like, so actually these things, if you had any future foresight thought, and at that time, you know, Oscar So White just happened, like, this was not making financial sense if you had any thinking about where the industry is going. But people did not. And they were working on some kind of old model. And even, you know, it's not just about like doing something that's morally right. It's just doing something that's actually business savvy. Right. But I mean, I'm still also furious with rage about it, because Rinko would have been just extraordinary character. And Scarlett's casting is one of the things that tanked that franchise, and why we're not going to see, you know, another live action of Ghost in a Shell, because, you know, it was just ultimately so bad for also many other reasons as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We should talk about that. We should have a whole discussion on that at another point. But,
I want to give one suggestion.
Yeah.
It's a alongside short stories, Serena, that you were speaking about. I found this particular anthology very interesting in the way, you know, it wasn't, you know, because we spoke about earlier about, like, you know, telling the space opera from a perspective of the people that are oppressed in a deck and stuff like that. But what I found very interesting in this specific anthology is that it completely changed the power dynamics in multiple of its stories and in multiple narrative ways. And it's Iraq plus 100. And it's the first science fiction anthology coming from Iraqi authors, both living in Iraq. Some of them, you know, under pseudonyms, and some of them living in exile. And it like the dynamics. I mean, at one of the narratives is how, you know, the entire Western world has succumbed to these religious sectarian warfare, and the purveyors of freedom now is Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and it's like 100 years into the future. And so that anthology had some very interesting inversions of the conventional mode of the way people today think. I mean, the way especially Western person thinks of geopolitics and cultural frameworks and stuff like that.
I think what you mentioned just answered a question we received from the public, from Peter, I guess. What about stories where an oppressed group strikes out to form its own colony to escape the dystopian aspects of its mother civilization? Maybe it's I don't know. It's very specific.
I mean, I don't find it particularly productive to continue representing people that are, you know, in the oppressed space today, in the oppressed space in the future. You know, I find it much more interesting actually to craft entirely new narratives, and not where, you know, the oppressed have taken the role of oppressor, though that can sometimes be interesting, but that's really not my interest. But really thinking of, well, what are the alternatives to current structures of power? And how we could imagine culture of contribution rather than culture of exploitation being the dominant culture in the world. And it's similar thing to what we spoke about space operas. It's not just like that I'm saying, oh, there should be no space operas. I'm just saying that the balance right now, I mean, we are all living on this planet. Nobody's living in space right now. And yet the amount of future stories that we have happening in outer space, on other planets, you know, in the spaceships and space stations, is completely disproportionate to the stories that we have happening in this world, engaging with the real issues of this world, and especially engaging with biosphere realities of this planet. So it's not saying, oh, let's not do space operas. It's just saying, well, let's have a much more balanced engagement with actually what is the lived reality currently for literally everybody on this planet, except a few people that are up in the space station.
Please, Bodhisattva, you wanted to add something? You were like, you're mute.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is such a good point. I also want to add to that, and also what Lauren has been saying as well, is we are also talking a lot about like books and films and things that require a language, right? Another thing that we need to kind of, when we are thinking about decolonizing the future, we also need to think about the images that we use when we talk about the future, right? You know, why is a skyscraper considered more futuristic than a bullock cart, for instance, right? So the moment you place that in any context, you would immediately start thinking, oh, this is futuristic and this is not, right? And this kind of doubles back to the point that Alexander made earlier, that, oh, you know, there's no real science. But the question that a lot of indigenous activists and others have been questioning very critically is the notion of science, is the notion of technology. Why would you call this way of thinking science and technology, right? Like the Amazon, like forest, like indigenous cultures have been doing that. You know, now we know that it's like, you know, they have been doing it for like 8,000 years or something. They have been managing that, right? So why is that not science? Why is that not technology? Why are we not bringing those into conversations? So also the images and the ways that people are kind of working with these images, challenging these images and creating new things, takes us way beyond the realm of science fiction, I think, personally, but it takes us very directly, I think, into futures, into many possible futures, new ways of thinking, new ways of looking, and new ways of arranging our minds as well. So yeah, I mean, let's talk about art. Let's talk about bodily movements. Let's talk about images that are breaking apart the skyscraper model of the future, right? So yeah, so thank you for that, Monica, Lauren, and everyone. Yeah.
Actually, what you're saying, I don't want to hijack on everybody else to speak as well. I'm so sorry. But what you said, Bodhisattva, it really brings forth to me one of my favorite quotes about science fiction by Walida Marisha and Adrienne Maria Brown. And specifically, I think of Adrienne Maria Brown's book, Pleasure Activism. And the quote is, all organizing is science fiction. You know, and I really think of activists and organizers, as well as people engaging with future policy, as in a way as science fiction authors, because they're crafting very real futures, they're communicating very real futures. And so, you know, I think of, you know, books such as Future Dreams, you know, I think of books such as Unapologetic by Charlene A. Carruthers, which is a Black, queer, and feminist mandate for radical movements. And for me, these are, you know, these are more relevant to future thinking than like 95% or more of popular science fiction.
Yeah, it brings to mind that the idea again of like so as we are agreeing that we're living in this colonized mindset at the planetary scale, we have our language, we have all idiomas, we have all languages, whatever language we're speaking. But within that language, there are the nuances and ways of speaking that are embedded and encrusted with our power structures, our class dynamics, gender dynamics, right? As well as as we've been speaking about, like, what is the essence of culture? What is the essence of what it is to truly be a human and an embodied human? It has to do with the foods we're eating, our relationship to the foods we're eating, to what we're growing, the idea of consumption is huge, and the way we're moving, like truly the way we are moving our bodies. And I am focused very specifically, again, around this idea of adornment and how we are working with our bodies as a communication tool. And somebody wrote in a Q&A, which I wanted to address, around the idea of futures literacy. And I just think that, so I have recently been designing services that have a goal of futures literacy and futures outreach. Because so here we are in this structure, all the buildings, all the architecture, everything is embedded with meaning, this crystallization of beliefs and meaning of thought. It is largely imposed upon us. We're not building our own homes right now, generally speaking. We're not making our own clothes. We don't get to choose the roads that we're driving on, really, or the cars, or the way things are put together. So as creators, we have to take the responsibility to bring the future's thinking into praxis, right? Beyond, in addition to images, in addition to film, in addition to literature, in addition to books, it has to be actually designing services and products that are representations of the future and that are the crystallization of those protopian, plural futurist beliefs, right? So I see that as a huge step and solution of how we can create futures literacy. So the way that I do it is I have a salon, right? I'm a hairstylist. So I use the opportunity of clients coming into my space to introduce these topics. We talk about hair texture, we talk about hair color, we talk about what are you feeling and seeing when you're looking in the mirror, what are the words you're using about yourself. And that might seem incredibly simple, but it is, I believe, the actual key method, or one key method, into starting this reflexive conversation about our embedded beliefs that we are projecting into the futures that we have inherited from our histories.
Perfect.
I want to give a shout out to what you just spoke, Lauren. My friend Emma DeBeery's book, Don't Touch My Hair. And I think there's an American version that is called Twisted. Mm-hmm. You know, and Emma speaks about, and she, you know, she speaks about it in her book, but she also, you know, is a commentator on TV and on social media, on all of these ideas around decolonizing beauty, mm-hmm. and how it's not just a superficial thing, mm-hmm. and how peeling off these layers of you know, colonialism and capitalism is actually really, really important. You know, it's not superfluous, because it stabs sort of at a very core identity of who we are as cultural beings, and as humans, we are cultural beings. Mm-hmm. And so these things aren't just some kind of like superficial.
It's not superficial in any way. I mean, when you imagine the economy that is created by media and visions of aspiration, which has to do with future, it and the way it impacts the environment, you know, it's just an incredible economy and ecology that has to do with separating the human, as we all are, from our own identities and our own natures. That happens at the individual scale, at community scales, and within, you know, our national identities. And that structure, I believe, is the thing that has to break to bring new visions of future.
All right, we are approaching the end of this amazing panel. I'm so happy that you joined us. Such a rich conversation, and we could spend hours and hours talking here, but we need to finish this. And so I just wanted to say thank you for all of you. And if you want to add a brief note, like a goodbye, here's your chance.
I feel Alexander didn't get the chance to talk enough. He should be doing the closing notes.
Yeah, but I would ask to put on the chat. Maybe I will share the chat afterwards. So, yeah, but you can say it.
I wrote a suggestion on a solar punk anthology that was published in Brazil, and that's now translated into English by Fábio Fernandes. Yeah. Well, you can follow my work at the YouTube channel Fantastic Cursos, where I try to explain. I'll write here, where I try to explain concepts, conventions, and ideas about science fiction, Gothic, fantasy, weird, to writers, teachers, and teachers and writers. Yeah, I will write here the YouTube channel so that you can follow you can follow my work. Yeah. And thanks, Lidia, for the invitation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
YouTube channel.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I don't want to say anything. If you want to leave some contact for people to reach you, but yeah, I'll be saving the chat. And yeah, thanks everyone. Have a nice week. And this is it. Bye-bye.
I want to be friends with y'all. Let's connect.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
a nice channel where we're not hating on each other and being like, oh. You know, I'm like, Bodhisattva, how come I was in Oslo last year and we didn't meet? Like, what the fuck?
Next time.
We are hanging next time. I'm not leaving you an option. And Serena, thank you so much. And Alexander, and obviously Lauren and Lydia. I know you. Everybody doing wonderful work. It's really inspiring to see peers just, you know, standing up for what's right in the realm of sci-fi in the future.
Yeah, thank you all. Lovely to share.
Have a nice week.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.